So here are a few more ideas that I put on paper. You'll get this again later. So when you think of the brain, as I just said, I want you to, in this conversation, we're going to focus on a couple of different structures. We're going to focus on microglia or microglia, that's the immune system of the cell, of the brain. Astrocytes are kind of the glue or supporting structure cells, blood-brain barrier, and neurons, right? Usually when we think of the brain, we just think of neurons, right? Receptors, mitochondria, neurotransmitter precursors, phenylalanine, tyrosine, 5-hydroxytryptophan, melatonin, hormonal flex, etc. Well, that's why I put this last, because what happens here is affected by what happens here. So if you want these neurons, number 4 on my list, if you want those neurons to perform well, we have to attend to the other 3 preceding elements: microglia, astrocytes, blood-brain barrier. So let's think of creating the optimal environment for this remarkable organ. And in this context, we're not going to think too much about diagnostic labels. Same thing that David Hasse said earlier, even though he's not seen my notes. So I think that's pretty much the same. Yeah, so we're going to focus on, we're going to use a wellness model. Like, how can we make things better rather than how can we mask the manifestations of some disease? And this is the same conversation. This is almost verbatim what David Hasse said, and I wrote this a month ago. We just talked about that. So let's get into the fun stuff. Let's make the brain work better. So I divided this up into several topics. Again, you have some of these notes, but since I just reorganized them, you don't have the current version, of course. So like I said, you'll have it soon. But in this case, you get to experience it raw. So special topic, and again, we're just going to go back to common sense. A long time ago, I defined alternative medicine as the clinical application of common sense. So let's apply some of that. We're going to look at patterns of neurologic dysfunction, but the underlying, before a pattern can exist, the dysfunction has to exist, right? The pattern is simply what we recognize, diagnose, label, and then medicate. But before that process becomes manifest, there had to be some dysfunction underlying what we later see. So with all nutritional deficiencies, what you do see are fatigue, depression, eventually dementia, psychosis, and then ultimately death. So for example, when we talk about the classic presentation of pellagra, niacin deficiency, right? There are variations on this theme, but basically it's depression, dermatitis, diarrhea, dementia, and death, right? So but that's true of all nutrient deficiency. You could say the same thing about B12 deficiency, right? That's why it's called pernicious anemia. Pernicious meaning dangerous. People ultimately died from it. So, how many patients go to their doctor because they have fatigue and depression?
So I'm just going to reinforce what I obviously just said in the presentation. A lot of times when people are diagnosed with depression, what they have is deficiency of something. They don't really have depression. Because as I just said here in the conference, all nutritional deficiencies lead to fatigue, depression, eventual dementia or psychosis, and sometimes then death. But, how many people legitimately have a brain disorder that entitles them to receive the diagnostic label of depression? Probably a really microscopic small group of people. But a lot of people who get the diagnosis on a more casual basis do have deficiencies of cortisol, DHEA, thyroid, testosterone, estrogen, B1, B2, B3, maybe B5, certainly B6, certainly magnesium, also zinc and selenium, if for no other reason than you have to have, zinc is definitely correlated with depression, zinc deficiency. Selenium also correlates with depression, even though maybe it's not as strong the correlation, but for example, selenium, other than functioning as an antioxidant in glutathione peroxidase, is necessary for the proper function of a lot of different things, but especially thyroid hormone, and thyroid hormone deficiency causes depression. So from a functional standpoint, the inability to properly metabolize, we might say, thyroid hormone could be due to selenium deficiency, and that could lead to depression, even though it's mediated by impaired thyroid metabolism. So again, virtually any nutrient you can name causes, deficiency of any nutrient you can name causes fatigue, depression, mental disorders, and maybe eventually death at the most extreme, even though that's pretty unlikely.